Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we start today, I'm excited to share some news about the podcast with you. I've really been thinking about how we can continue to support each other in our queer communities more. So I'm asking each guest to name a nonprofit of their choice, and I will make a donation in their name. But that's not all. This podcast has been a labor of love, and I don't want to sell advertising on the show because I don't want to get distracted from the important conversations we have here. I want to support our communities, and this is where you come in. I have set up a Patreon account at patreon.com/queerspirit. There are 4 levels of patronage to choose from, which offer gratitude gifts such as thank you shoutouts on the show, a sticker or enamel button with the Queer Spirit logo, and access to a live monthly meditation group. All Patreon funds remaining after the basic production costs will be added to the nonprofit donations. So go to patreon.com/queerspirit and help me to support our queer communities. My guest today is Fresh Lev White. Lev is a love and compassionate activist. He offers mindfulness, coaching, mediation, and diversity trainings as tools for shifting towards more authentic, conscious, and passionate living. He teaches and writes about how love and self-compassion are the ultimate gateways to loving and understanding others, thus healing our communities and planet. Today we talk about cultivating self-love and compassion as ways to overcome self-judgment and hatred. Lev shares how this work is the foundation for his facilitation work to teach others to dismantle microaggressions in their communities. To learn more about Lev's work, visit affirmativeacts.org. Hi, Lev. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Nick.
Yeah. So, Lev, I'm really excited to have you here because I know that you bring a lot of Buddhist concepts of love and self-compassion into your work. And it's something that I use a lot in my own work. I don't really talk about it publicly very much, not that I'm hiding it, but, I personally consider myself kind of a pagan Buddhist in terms of my own spiritual practices and bring a lot of concepts of Buddhism and Buddhist psychology into my work. So I was wondering if you could start out by sharing with us how you got interested in Buddhism and becoming a love and compassion activist.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So back in 2007, sort of the trail, I was on Facebook writing I learned the term pithy, notices about self-love and self-care, forgiveness and compassion. And then jump forward to about 2010, I had already been involved with a group of queer identified men of all masculinities at the East Bay Meditation Center. And I walked into EBMC one day, which is EBMC, the East Bay Meditation Center, and Spring Washam was there doing a talk, right? And I'd never really sat and been in a Buddhist center and listened to his talk. And in my mind, I'm going, she must be reading my posts. Like, she literally sounds like she's reading my posts. And then hearing her sort of translate in her own way the Buddhist sutras around compassion and self-compassion, that's when I realized I was in the right place. So my love and compassion activism was pre my discovery of Buddhism and includes broadly, all spiritualities and people who understand these paths towards living a healthy life. I'm laughing just because ultimately, if we're loving and compassionate with ourselves and others, everything else is taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm curious to hear your definition of compassion, because I know a lot of people have different ideas about what compassion is. And I think sometimes people, I wouldn't say they don't have it right, but they have a different idea of what compassion is, especially in comparing it with empathy. Sometimes I think people get those two things confused. So I wonder if you could share what compassion is for you.
Wow. And that's a wonderful question. And it so depends on the situation. So walking down the street, I might encounter homeless people. If I don't have, which I have for a long time, a self-compassion practice, keeping coins when I worked in San Francisco, keeping enough coins in my pocket so I could never say I don't have any money, because that was something that goes in for yourself. So my compassion practice was to give a $quarter whenever I could. When I couldn't, then be able to wish for that person that they be safe and healthy and resourced, right? So that's a way of giving compassion. In my personal experience, having hard relationships with people, I've learned that first being compassionate with myself about how I'm feeling, meaning accepting what's coming up for me, discovering where it's coming from, accepting how I'm feeling. And then often I'll have to go to forgiveness first, depending on the situation. And then from forgiveness, compassion's easy. So for me, compassion is I have a more holistic perspective on what's going on for this person, so that I understand that they're actually not at fault as much as they are reacting from their trauma place. Is that helpful?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I find with some of the people that I work with that sometimes self-compassion is a lot harder for them than having compassion for other people, and that
Absolutely.
they have so much judgment and criticism of themselves that it's hard for them to be compassionate towards themselves, but it's really easy for them to be compassionate towards other people. And I wonder if you have found that in some of your work too.
Yeah. So I've sort of literally just out of one of Kristen Neff designed a mindful self-compassion program. I went to the teacher training retreat back in January, and just when I was going to go to the next retreat, COVID happened in March. So I'm still learning in that area. And we're in a society where, I don't know about you, when I was a child, it was often whenever you thought about yourself or considered yourself over someone else, there was this thing about being selfish. And so selfish came up a lot, even in ways that you needed care. And again, I use a term that comes out of Buddhism as well, in the delusion of how we're supposed to be in the world. This idea of pulling ourselves up from the bootstraps, all this independent stuff, like all of that feeds this idea that we're not enough and that we're supposed to be putting out and taking care of other people. Depending on how you grow up, you can grow up with some codependency around, if you grow up with neglect, or you grow up with, I'm an Al-Anon person, so alcoholics in my family. Whenever growing up, taking care of other people always felt like what I was supposed to do. And it's interesting, if you don't mind me twisting a little bit, the other word that came up for me recently was resilience. And so what I found that what looks like resilience is often just surviving. And so compassion comes in, self-compassion comes in when we can acknowledge the ways that we've actually been harmed, and then discover that we're worthy of being taken care of, we're worthy of our own care. And for some people, I then bring in so that you can support others, just to get them to begin the practice, because they won't even begin to consider themselves unless it's about supporting other people. But when we're compassionate with ourselves, our sustainability goes up, our ability and availability for others really does go up.
Yeah.
Was that close?
Yeah. And I feel like, especially for queer folks and other oppressed communities, there's an extra layer that we have to sort of go through because of the ways that we may not have felt like there was space for us to have compassion for ourselves, on top of what you were talking about of just like needing to focus on other people. And I think especially for people who grew up in different religious backgrounds where the emphasis is on the other and not on the self, that it can be really hard to untangle that and unlearn that part of like, it's bad to focus on the self. It's selfish. I shouldn't be doing that. It's self-centered. It's egocentric kind of thing. But I think that some people get to the place of really just giving so much to others that they become depleted and forget to have that self-love and self-compassion too.
And can actually get angry with themselves for not being able to do more. And so one of the in the many stories that I've told, I talk about how the religious leaders that we have admired, with not enough acknowledging right now, there aren't enough female names that come up. But when we look at Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, the way that they put themselves first. And people are like, huh? And I'm like, they always took out time to meditate in prayer every day. They put themselves and their hearts and their needs first. They kept themselves fed, except, of course, in Gandhi's case when he was fasting. But the people that we admire, Maya Angelou, sat down and wrote. So Adrienne Rich sat down and wrote. So how do we, can we actually see in that practice a self-care practice, caring for our passion and what's coming up in our hearts? And it's interesting that we have to convince people. And it's interesting and it's not. So I used to go to Glide Memorial way back when, and, at that church, they didn't sing, I am a wretch, right? Whatever that song is, but they sang, I am someone, right? So this whole idea of singing, I don't know the song, but it's sort of like,
I think it's Amazing Grace, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Amazing Grace, right? And it's sort of like that in itself, it gets ingrained and says that you're not enough. But me growing up as a kid, I remember I used to think, if God is everywhere, right? The story that I was told, if God is everywhere and God sees everything, and, how come only the preacher can talk to God and I can't, right? So just this idea of like this intention around making us feel like we're not enough, it's a lot to have to come through, in whatever areas that you're getting it in, getting it from.
So I'd like to pivot momentarily and have you share with us a little bit more about the work that you do with
Sure.
coaching for mediation and training around some of these things.
Thank you. So I've pretty much stopped doing individual coaching. I liked it. And when I was a little kid, I thought I was going to be a minister for a little bit. And then I was going to be a rabbi. And then I was going to be a Buddhist. And so I've actually spent my life exploring many spiritualities. So what I enjoy doing is being in the front of the room, holding people and helping to create a container where people feel seen and safe, or whatever that means internally, at least externally, there's a safe space. Of course, what's going on inside might be different. And helping people in community connect. So I bring my coaching skills there. I bring my leadership skills there. Buddhism has helped open the door for me in ways that the LGBT trainings that I was doing since 2002, it just took it to a whole different level. So my work right now is I'm doing a lot of work focusing on dismantling microaggressions in workplaces and homes as a doorway to talking about transphobia, queerphobia, and racism. So that's almost elevator pitch.
So I'm wondering if you could share with us, for some of the listeners who may not know exactly what microaggressions are, because this is a really interesting topic to me, and it's also for some people really subtle sometimes to notice when they may be behaving in those ways or receiving some of those behaviors.
Yeah, so microaggressions, the old term that we used to say was passive aggressive language, or sometimes sarcasm. So it's these little sort of indignities or insults that can sometimes be couched as a compliment, and they can be so passive that we might not even know that we've experienced it until hours or days later. And it's embedded in our communication, especially, I'll just talk about Americans, but it's global. We're not taught to be vulnerable, which makes it really hard for us to communicate exactly what we're feeling. And so with that lack of vulnerability and then inability to be able to even relate to what we're saying, we've just found it easier to slight each other in some way or another. And the other way that shows up is we've been taught to be competitive from, if not in school, before school. And then that leads to judgment. So that we're always judging, and not just from the human sense of, oh, there's a tiger and there's a rabbit and I'm safe this way or the other, but we're literally spending time judging people for if their socks are showing. And really, judging people on that kind of. And so all of that is sort of some of the ways that we're controlled in our capitalist system. So microaggressions at the end of the day support us in being separate. And when we're separate, we fall apart.
And so, what are some of the ways that you work with groups and communities to begin to dismantle microaggressions?
First, we have to know that we have unconscious bias. So we talk about those unconscious biases and we talk about where they come from. And like I said, it might come from school, it might come from home. The ideas, certainly media is packed with it. So we understand what are our unconscious bias and where do they come from. And the trainings are 2 to 3 hours, so it's not like we can go real deep. But people, one person I remember saying, I've always idolized my brother. Like he's somebody that I really loved and followed. And he came up today and I realized that I really don't value a lot of what he values, but I've been sort of doing it anyway. And so just like sort of waking up to those sorts of things. I grew up like in New York City and DC as bars. So I was a bouncer for most of my career. Most of my career was spent, and I was a drinker. And then I grew up with people who drank. And caddy queens was a term that we used for many of the caddy queens. And you take on that language and it's playful and it's loving and it's cutting, it's slicing at the same time. And I remember waking up and I say having, awakening in 2011 to now I'm not drinking, but I'm still having these. I didn't know what was wrong, but I knew something was wrong. I was like, if my behavior is based on this bar mentality, this different kind of mentality, what can I change? And just being aware that, imagine if white people were aware that they only grew up in white communities and that maybe there was something to learn besides what they've been told. Men were aware that they were in a patriarchy and that there was something that they needed to know about what women were experiencing. It's sort of like that kind of thing, where we're not doing it on our own because we're too busy competing and judging and working hard.
Yeah. I mean, I know for myself that unconscious bias can come initially, as you said, from the family or your community where you grew up, just by repeating the same things that you hear without even thinking about what it is that they mean, until you get to a place where you're self-aware enough and maybe understand, oh, that actually may not be right. And that actually might be hurtful, even though like on the surface, that may not have been someone's intention, but it just becomes this inherited thing because of the way that you learn to behave and relate to other people.
And that other people are supporting you in that, right? This whole, I share about how I grew up. When I watched the news when I was a kid, you heard black man, black man, black man, black man, black man, and all the violence. You never heard a description of anybody else. And so, and this is highlighted in the movie 13th, where even as black people, you're trained to believe that, that you have to be on guard all the time. And so that's more of a, what I call a macroaggression, right? So that's a way that the media is used to help us to experience other people. Asian kids are good in math. How long did you hear that when you were a youth, right? And it's like supposed to be across the board. So, and then we then use our language and make assumptions based on that, right? So the unconscious, I was thinking last night, when I was first moved out on my own, how like I bought Cheer, Cheer, which is like the detergent. And I was just thinking about how I got that because that's what my mom bought. So naturally, that's what I would buy. And really, that's what we're doing throughout our lives until we wake up to something different. We're just doing what we always did or what was familiar.
So, Lev, can you talk about the impact that unconscious bias and these microaggressions have had on the Black and Brown queer communities?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Nick, especially during this time. So when, one of my personal stories is being an invisible Black butch in a world that doesn't acknowledge us at all. And especially, there are butches who wear makeup who might get a little bit more attention, but butches in general. But being Black in the queer spaces has been either an erotic gift for me or a way that, I've been excluded. And then transitioning to male has been challenging, where I've walked down streets and seen dykes who, particularly from the white community, who will just not even look at me, or, when I'm trying to get their attention, and realizing that, I'm in this body, so I look different, so I'm experienced as a threat, but also remembering that there were times when I never got attention in the white community. And so when we go a little bit further and we just look at our history and how long it's taken for the queer community at large to recognize trans people as part of Stonewall and trans women of color, and now there's a trans man whose name is slipping at this moment. Well, I'll have to put it on. So people of color who helped ignite or led the ignition of the Stonewall movement. So when we look at how we've sort of discarded the impact of trans women of color, particularly in our movement forward in visibility in the way that they've always been there, we also get to ignore how they've been targeted, attacked, and how they live in threat every day. And so the micro and macroaggressions simply show up in the so many groups that I belong to that are predominantly white, who don't want to even mention maybe some of, we have a say her name movement, right, with the TDOR. Their engagement with TDOR is they prefer it to be general and not have names brought in and keep it. And this is not a blame on white people, because this is a societal thing. We don't talk about death, we don't acknowledge harm, but the people who get harmed in the end, in a large way, are, people of color. And I think I want to say, lastly, these are what we grew up with. So when I was a kid, I don't know if I said this earlier, but when I was a kid, you heard on the news, black man did this, black man did that. So you kind of grow up, and if you don't grow up in black and brown communities and you're hearing terms like illegal, what's that? If you don't grow up in communities with people of color, you can tend to have the media be your teacher. And so again, this is not about blame. This is about, what can I do to support my community as a whole? Because it's all of us that makes it. And what a beautiful experience it is when we're a rainbow of people and experiences, honoring each other and standing with, and sometimes behind, and sometimes in front of each other, just really being able to be fluid, so that we're not ignoring at all that gay men are still getting killed. Actually, over the last couple of years, there's been an increase of murder of gay men. We don't have to exclude that when we also really recognize that trans women of color are experiencing the, excessive harm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the learning point here is about bringing consciousness to that which we might be unaware of, that we have been taught. These microaggressions, whether they're conscious or unconscious by the media and by cis white culture, is teaching other people, whether or not they know it,
right,
to have these biases that then become unconscious because they're so ingrained in our culture, and that we have to then start to become more aware of them and not beat ourselves up for not knowing them, but bringing in that self-compassion piece of oh, I get it now. This has been so ingrained and so erased from my education and from my experience in this culture. And not to beat yourself up, but just to have self-compassion and say, all right, I need to move forward from here and bring consciousness and awareness, and it's going to be work.
Exactly, right. So thank you for saying that, because it's the self-compassion, not that we just sit in that and bathe in it, but that we're actually doing it so that we can, influence the change that's possible for our larger community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then coming back to self, how can I be kind to myself as I elevate away from these types of behaviors and thoughts? How can I be compassionate? So for me in 2012, so I had 2011, I graduated in a really important leadership program that got me into Al-Anon, or led me towards Al-Anon, the East Bay Meditation Center by 2012, and I can't remember the other thing, or the other thing's not as relevant. And I just remember saying to myself, okay, it took you 40 blank years to learn all this behavior. How can we do the next 40-something years with kindness? You're not going to get it all overnight, right? And so I think last year I taught co-led a class for adoptees and former foster youth, all adults, adoptees, foster people, or people who were left in homes. And I read a compassion sheet which I learned from Tara Brach, that it's not our fault. So our behaviors, our thoughts, our ideas, they're not our fault. It's what we do once we discover that something's wrong. And sometimes there's nothing we can do, but can we not blame ourselves? Can we not blame ourselves for alcoholic parents, racist parents, abusive parents? Can we not blame ourselves for that? So really, I think, sometimes we have to be just told it's not your fault, which as a psychotherapist, is probably some of your work is like, how do we get people to see that they're worthy of love and care and compassion? It's ongoing work for me.
Yeah.
I can tell you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we're really talking about the ways of unpacking internalized hatred, internalized homophobia, internalized racism.
Mm-hmm. Internalized oppression. Yeah.
Yeah. And unburdening ourselves of those things and being okay with that and coming to the understanding that it is not our fault and that we can have self-love and self-compassion.
Yeah. And, you asked me specifically about the LGBTQ, I'll say alphabet community. And, the challenge of I had to ignore myself in relation to my family. So we never talked about me. Nobody asked me about me. I pop things in occasionally, but I actually invisibilized myself, right? So that I could be engaged. And I think, some of the work is connecting to other LGBTQ people. And maybe the practice in the beginning is to notice how you're treating others versus how you're treating yourselves. When you're kind to someone, can you be as kind to yourself? Can you be as generous to yourself? Can you be as compassionate to yourself? And I'm grateful to therapists and friends who can then hold me during those moments. And just know it takes time. And the other thing I want to bring up is I've had lots of conversations, especially with trans folks, but queer folks in general. Part of being compassionate with ourselves is not trying to force somebody else to be where they're not, and just being able to hold ourselves when we need to be held while our families or friends catch up or not, but really being able to love and honor ourselves no matter what, so that our happiness is not dependent on theirs or them being happy with us. That's huge and important.
Yeah. I wonder if you can share with our listeners, maybe to help them identify a little better, when you ask people to do that thing, what you had said, notice how compassionate you might be towards other people and to be just as compassionate to yourself, what you sort of see in terms of people's reaction when they may have resistance to that. Like, what might that look like for someone?
Yeah, I've had people just come right out and say, how can I be compassionate to me? For example, activists and white activists at the East Bay Meditation Center saying, these people are suffering and I've got all this privilege and I don't know how to, why do I need compassion? And that's when I had mentioned earlier, do it because you want to serve. As a doorway. So I'm trying to find a doorway to get them to be willing to try. And, of course, there are people who they're numb, and so they're not necessarily compassionate towards others either. And in Buddhist practice, when I first started learning what we call the metta practice, where phrases such as, may I be happy, may I be safe, may I be free, just for brevity, if we're encouraged, if we can't start with us, we can start with, our cat, our bunny, a baby that we love. And through that practice, it gets in. I've been sharing with my groups about how when I do these practices, it gets me every time, because I want to be the voice in your head saying, may I be happy. Not, there used to be, I can't remember her name, Louise Hay, who was a beautiful teacher, but she often used you. So she would say, okay, we're going to do this, may you be happy, may you be safe. So I want to say, may I, as I'm saying it for me, you're hearing may I. And so, it just even is my practice. And so we're both getting it at the same time.
Yeah, I actually prescribe that practice a lot to my clients, to have a loving kindness practice. And
Nice.
what I have them do is to imagine sending it to their younger self when they say, may you be free, may you be happy.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's a little easier for them than imagining their current self
Yes.
saying, may I be happy, may I be free.
And with the trans community, I remember having a session with a woman who talked about her dead name and how much she didn't like the younger person. She didn't want to have anything to do with them because they weren't in the body. And we ended up having this conversation about how she wouldn't be there without them, and about how courageous and strong and powerful they were, so that she could then go back and be like, oh yeah, that person got me here, and so was able to then have more appreciation and love for them. It's what you said just reminded me of that, and the importance of us being able, being able to honor our whole lives.
I'm curious if in your group facilitation work, if you ever have people practice like in real time, sending loving kindness to another person, like sitting across from them or something like that.
Yeah. Well, time permitting, we will do ourselves, and then we'll do the people in the room. And then we might do the larger, if I'm doing an LGBT group, we'll do the larger LGBT community. And then we do the world. But absolutely, just, now we're on screens.
Mm-hmm.
So if your eyes are closed, maybe you can remember a face, or there was an exercise I did with someone where you look directly, where I will look directly at you. You can't see that I'm looking at you, but I'm sending you metta.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
So, Lev, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
Wow. Everybody's my teacher. I don't want to identify one person. And Larry Yang comes to mind because of his leadership with really raising up the experience of LGBTQ and people of color experience. And he has a beautiful book called Awakening Together. So other than that, I was born with something that I really try to honor. And that was, I've always loved people. I've always loved people. I've always cared about people. So the practice of just being able to honor myself is the practice that keeps me going. And as I become more vulnerable with me, I tell people I can cry in front of a room, but alone it's a challenge, right? With my history. So with my particular history. So just being able to honor that you, for example, were somehow called to me or called me in, honoring these experiences. Whereas years ago, I could tell you that I would just be too afraid and with too much self-doubt. So I feel like there's the same spirit that got my drunk butt home at 4 a.m. at 15 years old, riding New York City subways in the 70s and 80s. When I was supposed to get home safely. Yeah, I honor that, as the palm tree outside my window that I get to gaze at. Yeah, when I need to be held.
So are you working online now with groups and people since we're all isolating from each other?
In the beginning of March, I had a lineup of gigs and everybody canceled. They just cut because I do live facilitation. And then I started teaching mindfulness. So I was called to do that, and I tried it and I got it, and it was beautiful. So I've probably taught 20 or so classes over the last couple of months, and then facilitated quite a few trainings, mostly on dismantling microaggressions, some on trans and LGBT allyship. But I've been doing sustainability circles for people of color and, talks for LGBT people. I was supposed to do 30 days of meditation on Facebook when COVID started, because it was supposed to be over in 30 days. And then 63 days, I ended up doing 70 something days. I took a break at 63 and I've done a few more. But so I found that maybe it's you, but it's not you. You're easy to connect online, whatever you've got going on that makes you open and available. I find that we can connect with people online pretty easily, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just got to know how to be open.
Yeah. So how can people find you and learn more about your services and your offerings?
Yeah, I have a website that's affirmativeacts.org.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm on LinkedIn, fresh, Lev in quotation marks, white. I'm not too hard to find.
Okay.
Yeah. I really appreciate you having me on and your questions.
Yeah. Thank you for being here. I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.